I call Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it is a pleasure to rise and speak to the first reading of the Child and Family Protection Bill, a bill that Labor does support, but a bill that Labor supports with some misgivings because we do think this is an opportunity missed. Mr Speaker, the bill is very important, and I certainly want to wish the Select Committee well in its deliberations. I know that in deliberating on this bill they will hear many heart-wrenching stories. They will hear some facts and some information that will be difficult for Select Committee members and officials to comprehend and to deal with. But nonetheless, hearing those stories is going to be incredibly important in terms of making this the best legislation that it can be. Because what we already know from Labor's perspective is that this legislation is not the best that it can be. It's a reasonable start, but we are deeply disappointed that while this bill is being promoted, the bill that had been prepared, the domestic violence reform bill that had been prepared by the previous government, still languishes on the order paper and in fact would address the issues contained in this bill as well as many others. And I think, Mr Speaker, it's the other issues that I want to spend some time pursuing, because it's appropriate that we debate this particular bill today, as today is the day that a lobby group called It's Still Not OK has taken the opportunity to brief the government on work that it believes the government should be pursuing through legislative means on the issue of domestic violence. And not many of those issues, sadly, are actually covered by this particular bill, but some of them were actually and are actually covered by the bill that sits languishing on the order paper, and the government does have the opportunity right now to bring that bill forward and actually debate that much more comprehensive bill, which would address some of the issues of the lobby group that has been to see the government. And I hear the government making some supportive noises about the recommendations that group has made, and yet they have an opportunity right now to be addressing some of the recommendations that group has brought forward to them. There's already a bill, a piece of legislation that is sitting on the order paper that could be debated right now that is stronger than the one that we have in front of us that would address some of those issues. Mr Speaker, I haven't had a lot of time to actually have a look at the report that was delivered to government. I've only had access to it over the last few hours. But it is interesting to note that when this group, and this group is mainly women who are survivors of domestic violence, they are the people involved in this lobby group, when they approached the Department of Women's Affairs and they were looking for someone to discuss their concerns with, they were actually shuffled on from the Department of Women's Affairs, which I think is appalling actually. And it's a great shame that I'd like to actually hear the Minister take a call, the Minister of Women's Affairs, take a call on this debate, because I've heard her so many times before say that dealing with family violence and domestic violence is a priority for her department. But when this very important lobby group went to see her department, they could find no one. In fact, I'll just quote from their report, their recommendations say, Women's Affairs, we approached this department first when looking for someone to discuss our concerns with. There was no one who could discuss our issues with us. We were referred to the Ministry of Social Development. Now, I think that's a poor response from the Department of Women's Affairs, whose minister claims that she sees family violence as being a top priority for her department, and yet they were not interested to hear what this particular lobby group had to say. So that is something that I would like the government to actually resolve, because clearly domestic violence does affect many more women than it does men. More often than not, women are the victims and men are the perpetrators, and on the odd occasion it happens the other way around. But let's not fool ourselves for a minute. The gender analysis is very, very clear on this. It is mainly women, and it certainly is in the main women who end up losing their lives as a result of extreme acts of domestic violence. Mr Speaker, in referring to the It's Still Not OK report, one of the other interesting observations that they had to make in their experiences, and remember These are the experiences of women who have suffered at the hands of people who they thought loved them in the area of domestic violence. One of the observations that they make is that they have all found that it's Women's Refuge that singularly has provided them with the support to leave behind domestic violence. And I want to reflect on that because they also make the observation that they're finding that Women's Refuge is underfunded. And certainly in the area that I come from in Hamilton, it has been significantly underfunded by this government because there has been... Oh, community response. Okay, so Joe Goodhue thinks that community response has fixed the problem. Well, I'm sorry to give that member a dose of reality, but it has not fixed the problem at all. Because if the member would care to listen to the story of Te Whakaruruhau, the Māori Women's Refuge in Hamilton, then she might learn something about the very real situation that's happening on the ground. Because in this particular situation, the Women's Refuge in Hamilton had the money that other women's refuges have, but they also had additional funding brought about by the Labour government through Te Puni Kōkiri. And I do wish the member would actually listen to the facts. So in Hamilton, the Women's Refuge had additional money to provide services, a proper service where they went out every time the police were called to a domestic violence incident. They were accompanied by a Women's Refuge worker, and that was trialled in Hamilton. And in order to do that, the Labour government gave additional funding to the Hamilton Women's Refuge to trial that very successful pilot. And as a result, there has not been a domestic violence-related death in our city for some years since that was instigated. Oh, well, I'm sorry, but if that member doesn't see what having a successful pilot that has stopped domestic violence deaths in my city has got to do with the issue, then she's missing the issue altogether. Because then what happened was that when the Te Puni Kōkiri money finished, which was to be replaced by the Pathways to Partnership funding that the Labour government had put in place, when the election happened and National came in and took away the Pathways to Partnership funding, then so went that money that Women's Refuge depended on to provide a proper service in terms of helping the victims of domestic violence. And so what has been the outcome of that? Because what they've actually seen is a funding shortfall of some $400,000. So as a result of a national government being elected, the Hamilton Women's Refuge is $400,000 worse off in terms of providing that service. That is true, and that minister knows it. The Minister of Social Development does know this because she's actually been told this information from Women's Refuge. And what it meant is that they had to make 14 staff members redundant. They also had to stop leasing some of the properties that they were using to keep women safe in the community. So with that funding shortfall of $400,000, Minister, 14 staff members made redundant. But those 14 staff members are so committed to actually dealing with the issue of domestic violence that they actually then came back and volunteered their time over Christmas because they knew that over Christmas that was going to be a particularly tough time for domestic violence, particularly in an economic recession for our community. So out of the goodness of their hearts, even though they had been made redundant because that government took their Pathways to Partnership funding away, out of the goodness of their hearts they came back and volunteered and kept that service going over Christmas. Now, that's what people do when they really care about the issue of domestic violence. And I call on the government to not only pass this piece of legislation, but to also deal with the recommendations that the lobby group has come and talked to them about today. And part of doing that would be to actually proceed with the domestic violence reform bill that was put forward by Labour. Let's not play politics about this. Yes, it was Labour who came up with that superior piece of legislation, but it's on their wall to paper. Just pick it up and run with it. I also urge the government to sort out the situation in Hamilton, because I'm really proud that my city hasn't had a domestic violence related death since the Women's Refuge started implementing this very good program. And I don't want to be saying I told you so.